You are bent over in a field. Your back is screaming. Your hands are bleeding. The sun has been beating down on you for 6 hours straight, and you've got at least 6 more to go before you can collapse into your pathetic excuse for a bed. You're 23 years old, but your body feels 50. You smell like a combination of manure, sweat, and despair. And the worst part? This is actually one of your better days. Welcome to life as a medieval peasant. Now I know what you're thinking, but wait, we just did a video about how much it was terrible to be a knight. Surely being a peasant couldn't have been worse, right? At least knights had armor and horses and got to fight in battles. Oh, you sweet, naive person. Let me tell you something. Knights had it bad, sure, but peasants? Peasants had it so much worse that knights would look at peasant life and think, yeah, I'll stick with my crushing debt and probable death in battle, thanks. Because here's the thing about being a medieval peasant. You had all the suffering with none of the glory, all the backbreaking labor with none of the social status, all the danger with none of the fancy equipment. You were, quite literally, the bottom of the social hierarchy, and everyone above you, which was everyone, was actively trying to squeeze as much labor and resources out of you as humanly possible. You couldn't leave. You couldn't change careers. You couldn't even complain without risking serious punishment. You were born a peasant, you'd die a peasant, and in between, you'd work yourself into an early grave, while everyone with more power than you extracted every possible ounce of value from your existence. And the worst part? History barely remembers you. We have records of knights, nobles, kings, bishops, all the important people. But peasants, you were background noise, expendable labor, the medieval period's equivalent of human machinery that no one bothered to maintain properly. So buckle up, because we're about to dive deep into exactly why being a medieval peasant was one of the worst possible existences in human history. And trust me, by the time we're done, you'll be grateful for literally every aspect of modern life, from indoor plumbing to labor laws, to the fact that you can quit your job without someone hunting you down like a fugitive. Let's get medieval. And by medieval, I mean absolutely miserable. Chapter 1. You own nothing, or welcome to feudal servitude. Let's start with the most fundamental problem of peasant life. You owned basically nothing. Not your land, not your home, not your crops, not even really yourself. You were trapped in the feudal system, and the feudal system owned you. Here's how it worked. All land theoretically belonged to the king. The king granted land to his nobles in exchange for military service and loyalty. Those nobles granted portions of their land to lesser nobles and knights. And at the very bottom of this pyramid scheme were you, the peasant. You lived on land that belonged to your lord. You farmed strips of land in the lord's fields. You lived in a cottage that you built yourself, but that was legally your lord's property. Everything you produced went to your lord first, and you got to keep whatever was left over, if anything was left over, and you couldn't leave. This is the part that really drives home how bad it was. You were what's called a serf, not quite a slave, but not really free either. You were tied to the land, which meant you couldn't just pack up and move to another village, or try to find better opportunities elsewhere. If you tried to run away, you'd be hunted down as a fugitive. Your lord had legal authority to drag you back and punish you. Some lords would brand runaway serfs, literally burning a mark into their flesh to identify them if they tried to escape again. The legal term for your status was villeinage in England, but it amounted to the same thing across Europe. You were unfree. You couldn't marry without your lord's permission. You couldn't send your children to learn a trade without permission. You couldn't leave the manor without permission. Even if you somehow earned money, which was rare, you couldn't freely spend it or use it to buy land and improve your situation. Your lord had first claim on anything of value you possessed. Now let's talk about what you owed your lord, because this is where things get really oppressive. First, there was labor service. You owed your lord a certain number of days of work per week, typically 3 days, but it could be more during planting and harvest seasons. During those days, you weren't working your own fields. You were working your lord's fields for free. So right off the bat, Half your working week was unpaid labor for someone else. And this wasn't light work. This was the hardest agricultural labor, done with primitive tools in all weather conditions. Then there were the fees and taxes. Oh, the fees and taxes. You paid a tax to grind your grain at the Lord's mill. You had to use the Lord's mill. Using your own hand mill was forbidden because it deprived the Lord of revenue. The tax was usually about 1/16 of your grain, which might not sound like much until you realize that grain was your primary food source and you were already struggling to grow enough. You paid a tax to bake bread in the Lord's oven. Again, you had to use the Lord's oven. Baking your own bread at home was often prohibited. You paid a tax to have your ale brewed. Ale was a staple drink because water was often contaminated, so this tax affected basically every household. You paid taxes when you got married, called merchet. Your lord had to give permission for marriages, and that permission cost money you probably didn't have. You paid a death tax called harriet when you died. Typically this meant your best animal or tool went to the Lord. So when you died, and your family was already struggling with the loss of your labor, they also lost your best ox or your only decent plow. You paid fees to use common resources like forests and streams. Want to gather firewood? Pay up. Want to fish? Pay up. Want to graze your animals on common land? You guessed it, pay up. If you had a son, you paid a fee for him to learn a trade or leave the manor. If you had a daughter, you paid for permission to marry her off. If you wanted to sell anything at market, you paid a fee. There were fees for crossing bridges on the Lord's land, fees for using roads, fees for basically existing and trying to survive. And all of this was on top of the church tithe, 10% of your produce that went to the Catholic Church. This wasn't optional. This was mandatory, enforced by both religious and secular authorities. Let's do some math. Say you're a peasant farmer with a small plot of land. After 3 days a week of unpaid labor for your Lord, you have 3 or 4 days to work your own fields. From what you grow, you owe 10% to the church as tithe, portions to the Lord's mill, oven, and brewery, harriet when someone dies, merchet when someone marries, various other fees, and taxes throughout the year. By the time all these obligations were met, you might keep 50% of what you produced. Maybe, in a good year, in a bad year, crop failure, animal disease, bad weather, you might not have enough left over to feed your family. But your obligations didn't decrease just because you had a bad harvest. The Lord still wanted his labor and his fees. The church still wanted its tithe. So you'd go into debt. You'd borrow grain or money to meet your obligations and feed your family. And debt was nearly impossible to escape because you couldn't increase your income significantly. You were already working every available hour, and all the land and resources were controlled by people above you. Some peasants fell into debt. So severe, they essentially became debt slaves, working exclusively to try to pay off debts they'd never escape. And these debts could be passed down to your children, who'd inherit your obligations along with your poverty. The system was designed to extract maximum value from peasant labor while giving back the absolute minimum necessary for survival. You weren't valued as a human being. You were valued as a unit of agricultural production. And here's the really insidious part. The system was justified through religion and social ideology. You were told that God had ordained the social hierarchy. Nobles ruled because God wanted them to. You were a peasant because that was your divinely appointed place in the cosmic order. The church taught that accepting your lot in life was virtuous. Questioning the social order was sinful. Your suffering in this life would be rewarded in heaven, assuming you were obedient and didn't challenge authority. So not only were you trapped in grinding poverty and unfreedom, but you were also told that this was good, that this was how things were supposed to be, and that trying to improve your situation was going against God's will. Some peasants believed this. Others resented it, but felt powerless to change anything. The few who did rebel, and we'll talk about peasant rebellions later, were usually crushed brutally, serving as warnings to others who might get ideas about resistance. You owned nothing. You controlled nothing. Your life was not your own. You existed to to serve those above you, and the entire social, economic, and religious system was structured to keep you in that position. Medieval feudalism. It's not quite slavery, but the difference is mostly technical. Chapter 2. The work never ends, or farming with medieval technology. Now let's talk about the actual work you did as a peasant, because the labor itself was brutally hard in ways modern people can barely comprehend. Medieval agriculture was backbreaking, dangerous, and required every member of your family to work constantly just to produce enough food to survive. And you were doing all of this with technology that was primitive at best. Let's start with plowing. If you were lucky enough to have access to a plow and a draft animal, most peasants had to share these resources or rent them from the Lord. You'd spend days preparing fields for planting. Medieval plows were heavy and difficult to maneuver. The ox or horse pulling the plow wasn't exactly enthusiastic about the work. The ground was often rocky, filled with roots, and resistant to cultivation. You'd walk behind that plow for hours, guiding it, dealing with it getting stuck or breaking, breathing in dust, straining every muscle in your body. And this had to be done in specific seasons. Miss the planting window, and your harvest would fail. So you worked in whatever weather conditions existed during planting season. Rain, cold, heat, didn't matter. The works had to be done. After plowing came planting. You'd walk the fields, scattering seeds by hand, trying to distribute them evenly. This was backbreaking work. Hours of walking, bending, standing, walking, bending, standing. Your back would be screaming. Your legs would be exhausted, and you couldn't afford to mess this up. Seed was precious. Plant it too thick, and you'd waste seed. Too thin, and you'd get a poor harvest, get the distribution wrong, and patches of field would be barren while others were overcrowded. Then came the waiting period, where you'd pray that the weather cooperated. Too much rain and seeds would rot. Too little rain and they wouldn't germinate. Late frost could kill seedlings. Pests could destroy crops. Plant diseases could wipe out entire fields. You had no control over any of this. No weather forecasts, no pest control, no disease-resistant crops. You just planted and hoped. During the growing season, you had to maintain the fields. Weeding was a constant, endless task. You'd crawl through fields, pulling weeds by hand, day after day, because weeds competed with your crops for nutrients and water. This meant hours on your hands and knees in the dirt, in the sun, pulling plants. Your hands would be torn up from thorns and rough vegetation. Your knees would be bruised and aching. Your back would be in agony from the constant bending and crouching. You'd also need to protect crops from animals. Birds, rodents, deer, wild boar. All of them wanted to eat your crops. You'd have to guard fields, chase away animals, repair fences. In some areas, you'd take turns with other peasants on night watch, staying up to scare away nocturnal crop raiders. Then came harvest time, which was the most intense work period of the year. The entire harvest had to be brought in within a narrow time window. Wait too long, and crops might rot in the field or be damaged by weather. Rush it, and you might harvest crops that aren't fully mature. So, you'd work from dawn to dusk, every single day, until the harvest was in, cutting grain with sickles, hour after hour of bending over, grabbing grain, cutting it, binding it into sheaves, every muscle screaming, hands bleeding from cuts and blisters, heat, exhaustion, a constant threat. Your entire family would be in the fields. Your children, as soon as they were old enough to be useful, maybe age 5 or 6, would be working alongside you. Your elderly parents, if they were still alive, would help with lighter tasks. Everyone worked because everyone had to. After cutting the grain, you had to thresh it, beating the grain to separate the kernels from the chaff. This was done with flails, heavy tools that you'd swing repeatedly, smashing the grain sheaves. Hours of repetitive, heavy labor that would destroy your shoulders and back. Then winnowing, tossing the grain in the air. So the wind would blow away the lighter chaff, while the heavier kernels fell back down. This required good weather and a lot of time. And remember, a significant portion of this harvest wasn't even yours. Your Lord got his share first. The church got its tithe. The various fees and taxes had to be paid. What was left, if anything was left, was yours to store for the coming year. But harvest wasn't the only agricultural work. You also had to maintain your animals, if you had any. A pig or two, maybe some chickens, possibly a cow, if you were relatively prosperous. These animals had to be fed, kept healthy, and protected from predators and disease. Pigs could be grazed in forests, eating acorns and roots, but you had to watch them or they'd wander off. Chickens needed protection from foxes and hawks. Cows needed to be milked daily, a task that sounds simple, but was actually time-consuming and physically demanding, and you needed these animals. They provided food, meat, milk, eggs that supplemented your grain-based diet. Losing an animal to disease or predation could be catastrophic for your family's nutrition and economy. You also had to gather other resources, firewood for cooking and heat, which meant going into forests and cutting wood, hauling it home, chopping it for use. This was constant year-round work because fires had to burn daily for cooking and heat in winter. Water had to be fetched from wells or streams. This typically fell to women and children who'd carry heavy buckets or jugs multiple times per day. The well might be a significant distance from your cottage, meaning lots of walking with heavy loads. Food preservation was another constant task. You couldn't just store grain in a bin and forget it. You had to protect it from moisture, rodents, and insects. Grain stores had to be checked regularly. Moldy or insect-infested grain had to be sorted out. Vegetables from your garden, if you had one, had to be preserved for winter. This meant pickling, salting, drying, or storing in root cellars. All of this was labor-intensive and required knowledge and skill to do properly. And let's talk about the tools you were using for all of this work, because they were terrible. Plows were heavy and broke frequently. Sickles and scythes were iron or steel if you were lucky, but they dull quickly and need constant sharpening. Many peasants used tools made partially of wood, which wore out even faster. When tools broke, you either fixed them yourself if you had the skills, or you paid someone to fix them. Another expense. And tools were expensive relative to peasant incomes. A good iron plow blade might cost more than a peasant family earned in months. So you'd work with inadequate, worn-out tools, which made the work even harder and more dangerous. Dull blades required more force, increasing the risk of injury. Broken tool handles could cause accidents. Poorly maintained equipment was inefficient, meaning more hours of work for the same result. And all of this work was done while you were probably malnourished, certainly exhausted, and quite possibly sick or injured. There were no days off except Sundays and major religious holidays. And even then, there were chores that couldn't be skipped. You worked in all weather: rain, snow, heat, cold. The work had to be done. Crops don't care if you're tired or sick. Animals don't stop needing care because you're injured. Medieval agriculture was a never-ending cycle of brutal physical labor that consumed your entire life, from before dawn to after dusk, every day, every season, every year, until you were too old or too broken to work anymore. And for all of this work, this endless, grinding, body-destroying labor, you might produce just barely enough to feed your family and meet your obligations to Lord and church. Maybe. In a good year. In a bad year, you starved. But we'll get to that. Chapter 3. Your home is a hovel, or living in squalor. Let's talk about where you lived, because your home, as a medieval peasant, was barely a step above sleeping in a barn. Actually, in many cases, it literally was a barn. You shared your living space with your animals. A typical peasant cottage was a single room, maybe 15 by 20 feet if you were doing okay, smaller if you weren't. This one room was where your entire family lived. You, your spouse, your multiple children, possibly aging parents or other relatives. The walls were made of wattle and daub, basically a framework of woven sticks covered with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung. Animal waste was a construction material because it was plentiful and free. These walls were not well insulated. In winter, cold would seep through. In summer, heat would bake the interior. Rain could damage the daub, requiring constant repairs. The walls were also not very strong. They could be damaged by animals, weather, or just time. The roof was thatch, straw, or reeds, layered thick enough to hopefully keep out rain. Thatch roofs had to be maintained constantly. They'd rot, develop holes, get damaged by wind or nesting animals. You'd spend time every year replacing or repairing sections of your roof. And thatch roofs had a special danger: fire. They were extremely flammable. A spark from your fire pit could ignite your roof, and your entire cottage could burn down in minutes. This happened regularly in medieval villages, and when it did, you lost everything: your home, your possessions, possibly your food stores and animals if you couldn't get them out in time. The floor was dirt, just packed earth, maybe covered with rushes or straw for insulation. This meant your floor was always dusty or muddy depending on weather and traffic. Any spills would just soak into the dirt. Cleaning was basically impossible. You couldn't sweep dirt floor clean. You could only replace the rushes periodically. Furniture was minimal. You probably had a rough wooden table, maybe some stools or benches, shelving made from on planks, and sleeping platforms that were essentially wooden frames filled with straw. That was your bed, a pile of straw, maybe with a rough blanket if you had cloth to spare. You'd sleep in your clothes because you didn't have pajamas. Probably didn't even have a change of clothes. Most peasants owned 1 or 2 sets of clothing, worn until they literally fell apart, then patched and mended and worn some more. Your entire family slept in the same room. Privacy did not exist. You'd be sharing sleeping space with siblings, parents, possibly animals if it was cold, and you brought them inside for warmth and their protection. Light came from the doorway during the day. Most cottages had one door, and maybe 1 or 2 small windows. These windows didn't have glass. Glass was far too expensive. They'd either be open holes in the wall or covered with oiled cloth or animal membranes that let through some light while blocking wind and rain. At night, you had firelight from your fire pit. That was basically it. Candles were too expensive for regular use. Rush lights, dried rushes dipped in fat, were cheaper but still not used casually. Most nights, once the sun set, you'd have only dim firelight, and many people would just go to sleep because there wasn't much else to do in the dark. The fire pit was typically in the center of the room, just a stone-lined depression in the dirt floor where you'd build your fire for cooking and heat. There was a hole in the roof above it to let smoke out. In theory. In practice, your cottage would be constantly smoky. The smoke hole didn't vent in all the smoke, so the interior would be filled with a hazy, acrid smoke that would make your eyes burn and your lungs hurt. Respiratory problems were endemic among peasants, partly due to constant smoke inhalation. Everything you owned would smell like smoke. Your clothes, your blankets, your stored food, all of it would have that pervasive smoky smell, and you'd smell like smoke. Too, though given medieval hygiene standards, that was probably the least offensive thing about how you smelled. Cooking was done on the fire pit or in a cauldron hung over it. Your diet was monotonous, mostly bread, porridge made from oats or barley, maybe some vegetables from your garden, occasionally a little meat or cheese. You'd eat from wooden bowls with wooden spoons. Probably didn't have individual plates. You might share a bowl or trencher, a thick piece of stale bread used as a plate, with family members. Food storage was a constant problem. You had no refrigeration. You'd keep grain in bags or wooden chests, vegetables in a root cellar if you had one, or just in a cool corner of the cottage. Meat was salted or smoked, but it would still eventually spoil. Rodents were a constant plague. Mice and rats would get into your food stores. You'd try to protect food by hanging bags from rafters or storing things in sealed containers, but you'd never fully eliminate pests. You'd find mouse droppings in your grain, rat-gnawed holes in your bags. Evidence of theft every time you checked your stores? And remember how I mentioned you might share your cottage with animals? In many peasant households, especially in colder climates, animals would be brought inside during winter. Your cow or pig would literally be living in your house, sharing your space and air. This provided some warmth and protected valuable animals from weather and theft. It also meant animal waste in your living space, animal smells, and all the insects and parasites that animals carried. Sanitation was basically non-existent. You'd have a chamber pot for nighttime use, but it was just a ceramic or wooden pot that you'd empty outside in the morning, probably fairly close to your cottage, meaning the area around your home would smell of human waste. Bathing was rare. You might wash your face and hands regularly if you had easy access to water, but full-body bathing was infrequent. Water had to be hauled from a well or stream and heated over your fire if you wanted warm water. That was a lot of labor and fuel for something that seemed like a luxury, so you'd go weeks or months without bathing properly. You'd wear the same clothes day after day without washing them. Washing clothes meant hauling water, heating it, scrubbing with ash or lye soap if you had it, then drying, which took forever. Lice and fleas were constant companions. Everyone had them. You'd scratch all the time. You'd try to pick lice out of hair and clothes, but you'd never fully eliminate them. They were just part of life. Your cottage had no plumbing. Water came from a communal well or nearby stream. Waste went in a pit latrine outside your cottage, or just in a designated area nearby. These areas would smell terrible and attract flies and pests. The smell inside your cottage would be a combination of smoke, unwashed bodies, animal smells, if you kept animals inside, food smells, mildew from the damp walls, and general mustiness. By modern standards, it would be nearly intolerable. By medieval standards, it was just normal. And this one, smoky, smelly, cramped room was where you'd spend most of your non-working time, where you'd eat, sleep, give birth, care for sick family members, and eventually die. Your entire domestic life happened in this one small space that was barely adequate shelter. There was no comfort in a peasant cottage, no soft chairs, no comfortable beds, no warm baths, no pleasant atmosphere. It was purely functional, a place to sleep, eat, and shelter from the worst of the weather. That's all it was designed to be, and that's all it ever was. Your home as a medieval peasant was a hovel. And calling it that isn't an exaggeration. It was, by any modern standard, barely habitable, but it was what you had, and you'd work constantly to maintain even this minimal shelter, knowing that losing it would make your already terrible life even worse. Medieval peasant housing, proof that you can technically survive in conditions that would make modern people call the health department. Chapter 4. Food, glorious food, or actually just bread and hunger. Let's talk about food, because your diet as a medieval peasant was one of the most depressing aspects of your existence. It was monotonous, nutritionally inadequate, and frequently insufficient in quantity. And you worked incredibly hard just to maintain this terrible diet. Your primary food was bread, not good bread. Coarse dark bread, made from whatever grain you could grow or afford. Typically rye, barley, or oats, not wheat, which was more expensive and usually reserved for the upper classes. This bread was dense, heavy, and not particularly tasty. It was often made from mixed grains, whatever you had available. Sometimes it included other things ground into the flour to extend it, peas, beans, even acorns in desperate times. The bread would also contain grit from the millstones used to grind the grain. This grit would wear down your teeth over time, which is one reason medieval people had terrible dental health, even beyond the obvious lack of dental care. You'd eat this bread at basically every meal. Breakfast, bread, may be soaked in ale or water. Lunch, bread with perhaps an onion or some beans. Dinner, bread with whatever else you had, if you had anything else. Porridge was your other staple. Oats or barley cooked in water into a thick, gloppy mess. Maybe seasoned with salt if you had it, or some herbs from your garden. This was filling and provided calories, but it was boring beyond belief. Imagine eating basically the same porridge every single day for your entire life. Breakfast porridge, dinner porridge, year after year. That was reality for many peasants, especially the poorest ones. Vegetables came from your garden if you had one. Root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and carrots. Onions, leeks, cabbage, peas, beans. These would be eaten fresh during growing season and preserved, pickled, dried, or stored in root cellars for winter. But even these vegetables were limited by season and your ability to grow them. A bad growing year meant fewer vegetables. Garden pests could devastate your crops. You couldn't just go to a store and buy more. Meat was rare. Most peasants couldn't afford to slaughter their own animals for meat because those animals were too valuable alive. A pig provided multiple piglets and could be fattened for eventual slaughter, but only once. A chicken provided eggs regularly. A cow provided milk and calves. So you'd only get meat on special occasions. Major religious holidays, maybe a wedding or festival. The Lord might provide meat to peasants during harvest feast or other celebrations, but this was infrequent. When you did get meat, it might be from an animal that died naturally or was too old or sick to be useful anymore. This meant the meat was often tough, stringy, and not particularly good quality. Hunting for meat was largely forbidden. Forests and wild animals were the Lord's property. Poaching, hunting without permission, was a serious crime that could get you severely punished. Some peasants poached anyway, risking punishment because their families were starving, but it was dangerous. Fish was more accessible if you lived near water, but even fishing rights were often controlled by lords or the church. You might be able to catch small fish from streams, but the best fishing spots were reserved for those with more power than you. Dairy products, milk, cheese, butter, were available if you had a cow or goats, but many peasants didn't have dairy animals, and those who did had to be careful with them. Milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration. Cheese making required knowledge and equipment. Butter took time and labor to churn. The seasonal variation in your diet was extreme. Spring was actually one of the worst times. You'd depleted your stored food from the previous harvest, but new crops weren't ready yet. This was called the hungry season, and it's not a cute name. People actually went hungry during this period every year. Late summer and early fall after harvest were the best times for food availability. You'd have fresh vegetables, newly harvested grain, and relatively abundant food. Some lords would host harvest feasts where peasants could actually eat fairly well. But by late winter and early spring, you'd be down to stored grain, preserved vegetables, and hope. Food quality would decline as stores aged. Grain might be moldy. Preserved vegetables would be wilted and unappetizing. You'd be eating whatever you had left and counting days until new crops came in. And in bad years, crop failure from weather, disease, or pests, you'd face real hunger. Not, I'm hungry before dinner hunger. Real, gnawing, desperate hunger, where you're not getting enough calories to maintain your body weight and energy levels. During famines, which happened periodically throughout the medieval period, peasants would eat things that normally wouldn't be considered food. Tree bark ground into flour, grass, roots of wild plants, anything that would fill your stomach and provide some calories. People died in these famines. Lots of people, the weakest, children, elderly, those already sick would die first. Then others would follow, as malnutrition and starvation-related diseases spread through communities. Even in normal years, your diet was nutritionally inadequate by modern standards. It was heavy on carbohydrates from grain, light on protein unless you had reliable access to legumes or dairy, and often deficient in various vitamins and minerals. Vitamin deficiencies would cause various health problems. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C, especially in winter when fresh fruits and vegetables weren't available. Rickets from vitamin D deficiency. Anemia from iron deficiency. These conditions were common enough that they were just accepted as normal parts of life. Your diet also affected your physical development. Medieval peasants were typically shorter than modern people, partly due to genetics, but also due to chronic childhood malnutrition. Poor nutrition affected bone development, immune function, and overall health. And remember, you were doing brutal physical labor on this inadequate diet. You were burning thousands of calories per day through agricultural work, but you weren't necessarily consuming enough to replace those calories, especially during lean times. This meant you'd be chronically exhausted. Your body would be breaking down its own muscle tissue for energy. You'd feel weak and tired constantly, and yet you had to keep working because the work never stopped. Ale was your primary beverage, not because medieval people were all drunks, but because ale was safer than water. The brewing process killed bacteria, making ale less likely to make you sick than drinking from potentially contaminated water sources. This ale wasn't like modern beer. It was weaker, sometimes called small ale, and was consumed by everyone, including children. It provided some calories and was safer to drink than questionable water. Water was still consumed, especially by the poorest who couldn't always afford ale, but it was a gamble. Waterborne diseases were common, though medieval people didn't understand the connection between contaminated water and illness. Food preparation was time-consuming and required constant attention. Bread had to be baked regularly. Porridge had to be cooked daily. Whatever vegetables or other foods you had needed to be prepared. Fires had to be maintained for cooking. This work fell primarily to women, who would spend hours each day just on food preparation, in addition to all their other labor. A peasant woman's day included agricultural work, food preparation, childcare, maintaining the household, textile work like spinning, and weaving, and whatever other tasks needed doing. And after all of this work preparing food, what you'd eat was still bland, monotonous, and often unsatisfying. There were no spices for most peasants. Spices were expensive luxuries. Salt was the primary seasoning, and even that was taxed and controlled. Some peasants grew herbs for flavoring, parsley, sage, thyme, whatever would grow locally, but these only did so much to improve the taste of the same bread and porridge you'd been eating your entire life. The nobility, meanwhile, were eating meat, fish, refined wheat bread, sweetened pastries, spiced dishes, and generally having a much more varied and pleasant diet. You'd see what they ate when you served at the manor house or during festivals, and the contrast between their abundance and your scarcity would be stark. Your diet as a medieval peasant was a constant reminder of your low status. You ate peasant food, coarse, simple, barely adequate, while your betters ate. Well, food was just another marker of the social hierarchy, another way in which your poverty and powerlessness were made visible and tangible. Medieval peasant diet. It'll keep you alive, probably maybe, but you won't enjoy it. Chapter 5. Disease and Death, or Welcome to the Medical Dark Ages. Now we need to talk about health and disease, because as a medieval peasant, you were living in conditions that were basically designed to make you sick and kill you prematurely. Let's start with the basics. You were malnourished, exhausted, living in unsanitary conditions, exposed to animal waste, drinking questionable water, and had essentially no access to medical care. This meant you were constantly vulnerable to every disease and infection that came along. Infant mortality was staggering. Roughly 1 in 3 children died before age 5. Some estimates put it higher. This meant that if you had 6 children, which was common, you could expect to bury 2 of them before they reached childhood. The causes were numerous: infections, malnutrition, accidents, childhood diseases that would be minor today but were deadly then. Diarrhea could kill a baby through dehydration. Respiratory infections could be deadly. Fever from infections that we'd treat with simple antibiotics would kill children regularly. As a parent, you'd watch your children sicken and die, and there was nothing you could do. No medicine that worked, no doctors who could help. Even if you could afford one, which you couldn't, you'd just watch helplessly as your child's fever climbed, Their breathing became labored, and they slipped away. The psychological toll of repeatedly losing children was immense. Some parents became emotionally distant from infants, not allowing themselves to become too attached until the child survived those dangerous early years. Others were devastated by each loss, but had to keep going because there was no time for extended grief. The work still needed to be done. If you survived childhood, you still faced constant threats to your health. Tuberculosis was endemic, spreading easily in crowded, poorly ventilated living conditions. You'd see neighbors and family members develop the chronic cough, the wasting, the blood-tinged sputum. You'd watch them slowly decline over months or years until they died. Dysentery, severe bloody diarrhea caused by contaminated water or food, was common and often deadly, especially for children and the elderly. You'd become dehydrated, weak, and die from fluid loss and infection. Typhoid, typhus, and various fevers swept through communities regularly. These diseases spread rapidly in unsanitary conditions with poor hygiene. Once someone in your village caught it, others would follow. Some would recover, many wouldn't. Skin infections were constant problems. Any cut or scratch could become infected. Without antibiotics or proper wound care, infections could spread, causing sepsis and death. People died from infected blisters, from minor cuts that became serious, from scratches that should have been trivial. Parasites were universal. Intestinal worms affected nearly everyone. You'd have tapeworms, roundworms, and various other parasites living in your gut, stealing nutrition from food you ate. This exacerbated malnutrition and made you weaker and more vulnerable to other diseases. Lice and fleas, as mentioned, were everywhere. But these weren't just annoying. They could spread diseases. Typhus was spread by body lice. Plague was spread by fleas. These parasites could literally kill you. And speaking of plague, let's talk about the Black Death, because this was the ultimate nightmare of medieval peasant life. The bubonic plague hit Europe in the 1340s and killed roughly 1/3 of the entire population. 1/3? Imagine 1 out of every 3 people you know dying within a few years. That's what happened. For peasants, the plague was particularly devastating. You lived in crowded conditions perfect for disease spread. You had rats, carriers of the fleas that spread plague, in your homes and food stores. You had no way to protect yourself or understand how the disease spread. When plague came to your village, people would start developing fever, chills, and painful swellings in their lymph nodes, the famous buboes that gave bubonic plague its name. These swellings could be as large as eggs or apples, and they were agonizingly painful. Most people who caught plague died within days. There was no effective treatment. People would try everything: prayer, fleeing to other areas, isolating the sick, various folk remedies, but nothing worked reliably. You'd watch neighbors, friends, family members die. The death toll would climb so high that bodies couldn't be buried fast enough. Mass graves would be dug. The social fabric of villages would collapse as people either died or fled in terror. And for those who survived, life after plague was strange and traumatic. Villages were depopulated. Fields went unworked because there weren't enough people left to farm them. Families were shattered. The psychological impact of witnessing such massive death was profound. Even in normal years without major plague outbreaks, daily life was filled with health hazards. Agricultural work was dangerous. You could be kicked by animals, gored by oxen, injured by falling from carts or trees, crushed by equipment. Cuts from scythes and sickles were common. These tools were sharp enough to cut through grain stalks, which meant they could easily cut through flesh. A slip while harvesting could result in deep cuts to hands, arms, or legs. These injuries would often become infected. Without antibiotics, even a relatively minor cut could become a serious medical problem. You might develop gangrene, tissue death from infection, which could require amputation or could spread and kill you. Fractures and broken bones from accidents would often heal poorly without proper medical care. A broken leg might heal crooked, leaving you with permanent limp crushed fingers or toes might heal misshapen. You'd have to continue working, even while injured, because you couldn't afford to stop. Back problems were nearly universal among peasants from the constant heavy labor. Herniated discs, chronic pain, arthritis, these were just accepted as inevitable consequences of a life of physical work. Dental health was terrible, as we've mentioned. By middle age, most peasants had lost several teeth to decay or infection. Tooth pain was common, and there was little that could be done about it, except eventually losing the tooth. Vision problems couldn't be corrected. Eyeglasses existed, but were expensive luxury items far beyond peasant means. If your vision declined, you just had to deal with it, which made work more difficult and dangerous. Hearing loss from illness or age couldn't be addressed. You'd just gradually become deaf, making communication harder and isolating you from your community. Medieval medicine, such as it was generally unavailable to peasants. Physicians were for the wealthy. What peasants had access to were folk remedies, herbal treatments, charms, prayers, that sometimes helped through placebo effect or occasionally actual medicinal properties of herbs, but often did nothing. Childbirth was extremely dangerous for women. Maternal mortality was high. A woman might survive several births, only to die in a later one from hemorrhage, infection, or obstructed labor that couldn't be safely resolved. If you or your wife survived childbirth, there was still the risk of postpartum infection, puerperal fever, which killed many new mothers. Without antibiotics, these infections were often deadly. Life expectancy was low. If you survived childhood, a big if, you might live to your 40s or 50s if you were lucky. Many peasants died younger. The combination of hard labor, poor nutrition, lack of medical care, and disease meant that people aged quickly and died young by modern standards. And death, when it came, was often not quick or easy. You might die slowly from consumption, wasting away over months. You might die from an infected wound, suffering through fever and pain. You might die from cancer that went undiagnosed and untreated. You might die from any number of conditions that modern medicine could easily treat. When someone died, the body would be laid out in the home, washed, and prepared for burial by family members. This was done without any real understanding of disease transmission, so if someone died from an infectious disease, those preparing the body could catch it. Burials were usually in the village churchyard. In some areas, you'd pay a fee to the church for burial in consecrated ground. The poor might be buried in mass graves, or in areas outside the consecrated part of the cemetery, during plague years or other major mortality events. The death rate would overwhelm normal burial practices. Bodies would be stacked in mass graves, sometimes with minimal ceremony. The psychological trauma of this, having to bury loved ones without proper ritual, seeing stacks of corpses, would stay with survivors forever. The constant presence of death shaped medieval peasant psychology. You knew death could come at any moment, to anyone. You'd lose children, siblings, parents, spouses, friends. Grief was a constant companion. Some people became deeply religious, seeking comfort in beliefs about the afterlife. Others became fatalistic, accepting death as inevitable and unavoidable. Everyone developed coping mechanisms because they had to. The alternative was being psychologically destroyed by constant loss. And through all of this, the disease, the injuries, the death, you still had to keep working. Grief didn't pause your obligations. Illness didn't excuse you from labor. You worked while sick, while injured, while grieving, because stopping meant falling behind on obligations to your lord, which could lead to punishment or losing what little you had. Medieval peasant health, a combination of malnutrition, terrible living conditions, dangerous work, and no effective medical care. What could possibly go wrong? Everything could go wrong. Chapter 6. The Church Owns Your Soul, or Mandatory Religion with Fees. Let's talk about the Church, because religion wasn't just a spiritual matter in medieval life. It was a controlling, omnipresent force that extracted resources from you while dictating every aspect of your existence. The Catholic Church was the only game in town. There were no alternatives, no other denominations, no option to opt out. You were Catholic, period. And the church made sure you knew it owned you, just as much as your feudal lord did. First, there was the tithe. 10% of everything you produced went to the church. We've mentioned this, but let's really dig into what this meant. 10% might not sound like much, but remember, you were already giving massive portions of your production to your Lord through labor service and various fees. After the Lord took his share and the church took its tithe, you might be left with barely enough to survive. And the tithe wasn't flexible. Bad harvest? Church still wants its 10%. Lost half your crops to weather or pests? Too bad, pay up. Family member died and you're struggling? The church still expected its due. The tithe was enforced strictly. Church officials would check on peasant production and make sure the proper amount was paid. Failure to pay your tithe could result in excommunication, being cut off from the church and its sacraments, which in medieval society was a serious punishment that could make you a social outcast. But the tithe was just the beginning. The church also charged fees for basically every religious service, and in medieval society, you needed those services constantly. Baptism, that's a fee. Your newborn had to be baptized quickly. Medieval people believed unbaptized babies who died would go to limbo, not heaven. So you'd pay the fee, even if you could barely afford it, because the alternative was risking your child's eternal soul. Marriage, fee. You needed the church's blessing to be legally married. The ceremony itself cost money, and the priest expected payment. Poor peasants sometimes struggled to afford getting married, leading to informal arrangements that the church frowned upon, but that happened anyway. Confession, technically free, but priests expected donations, and confession was mandatory at least once a year. You were required to confess your sins, receive penance, and take communion, or you'd be in violation of church law. Burial in consecrated ground, fee. The church owned the cemeteries, and being buried in the churchyard, necessary, according to church teaching, for your soul's salvation, cost money. The poor might be buried in less desirable spots, or if they couldn't pay at all, in unconsecrated ground outside the cemetery proper. Want the priest to say prayers for your deceased loved ones to help their souls through purgatory? That's extra. Special masses, prayers, commemorations, all of these were available for fees that poor peasants often couldn't afford. The church also controlled your calendar. Sundays and numerous holy days were designated as days of rest. No work allowed. This sounds nice until you realize that rest meant attending church services, which were mandatory and conducted entirely in Latin that you didn't understand. You'd spend hours in church on Sundays and holy days, listening to services in a language you couldn't comprehend, standing the entire time. Pews weren't common in medieval churches. Those were for the wealthy, while the priests droned on. And these mandatory rest days meant you couldn't work your fields. Remember those time pressures we discussed in agricultural work? Imagine having several dozen mandatory rest days throughout the year when you weren't allowed to do necessary farming work, even if the weather was perfect or crops desperately needed attention. Some peasants would work anyway, risking punishment from the church. Others would lose valuable working time and fall further behind on their labor. The church also controlled marriage and sexuality with an iron fist. Intimate relations outside of marriage was a sin. Even within marriage, intimacy was heavily regulated. The church taught that marital relations were only acceptable for procreation, not pleasure. Certain acts were forbidden. Relations during Lent and various other holy periods were prohibited. The church taught that women were spiritually inferior to men, temptresses who led men into sin. Women were blamed for Eve's original sin and were considered naturally more prone to sinfulness. This religious teaching reinforced the social subjugation of women, who already had fewer rights and opportunities than men. Women were expected to be submissive to their husbands, to accept their suffering as part of their spiritual nature, and to seek redemption through obedience and childbearing. The church also controlled education. What little education existed was church-controlled. Priests were among the few literate people in villages, which gave them enormous power. They could read legal documents, write letters, keep records, all things peasants couldn't do for themselves. This knowledge monopoly meant peasants were dependent on church officials for interactions with the broader world. You had to trust that the priest was accurately reading tax documents or contracts because you couldn't check for yourself. Religious teaching emphasized acceptance of the social hierarchy. You were taught that your position as a peasant was divinely ordained. God had placed you in this station, and questioning it was sinful. The nobility ruled because God wanted them to rule. Your suffering was part of God's plan. This ideology was incredibly convenient for those in power and incredibly oppressive for peasants. It wasn't just that you were poor and powerless. You were told that this was morally correct, that trying to improve your situation was wrong, and that your reward would come in the afterlife if you accepted your suffering obediently. Some peasants genuinely internalized this teaching. They believed their suffering had spiritual meaning, and that obedience would be rewarded in heaven. This belief gave them comfort and helped them endure otherwise unbearable conditions. Others resented it, but felt trapped. Openly questioning the church was dangerous. Heresy, believing anything contrary to church doctrine, could get you excommunicated or, in severe cases, burned at the stake. So even if you had doubts, you kept them to yourself. The church also controlled access to the sacred and the supernatural. In medieval belief, the world was full of spiritual forces, saints, demons, angels, and the ever-present possibility of miracles or curses. The church claimed to be the mediator between humans and these forces. Need a saint's intercession? Pray at their relic, which the church controlled. Worried about demonic influence? Get the priest to bless your home for a fee. Want protection from evil? Carry a blessed medallion, sold by the church. The church essentially monopolized spiritual services and charged for them, much like it monopolized education, marriage, burial, and every other important social function. Pilgrimages were another way the church extracted resources. You were encouraged to make pilgrimages to holy sites, local shrines, regional saints' tombs, or major destinations like Rome or Santiago de Compostela. These pilgrimages required time away from work and money for travel, lodging, and offerings at the shrines. For peasants, making a major pilgrimage could be financially devastating, but the social and spiritual pressure to go was intense, especially if you were seeking healing, doing penance, or trying to demonstrate your piety. Indulgences, payments to the church that would reduce your time in purgatory or absolve you of sins, were another revenue source. The church literally sold forgiveness, and people bought it because they believed it affected their eternal fate. The physical church building itself was a constant reminder of your subordination. It was the largest, most impressive structure in the village, built with resources extracted from peasant labor and donations. You'd helped build it through obligatory labor, yet it wasn't really for you. It was a symbol of church power and authority. Inside, the decoration made clear the social hierarchy. The wealthy had reserved spaces, sometimes private chapels. Peasants stood in the back or sides. Imagery depicted saints, biblical scenes, and often the torments of hell awaiting sinners, which definitely included peasants who didn't pay their tithe or follow church rules. Priests themselves were often not particularly holy or helpful. Many priests were younger sons of minor nobility who entered the church as a career, not because of genuine religious calling. They might view their parish as a source of income to be exploited, not a community to shepherd. Some priests lived relatively comfortable lives compared to their parishioners, collecting tithes and fees while doing minimal pastoral work. Others were poor themselves, barely better off than peasants, struggling with their own survival while trying to meet church obligations. The quality of spiritual guidance you received was a lottery based on which priest you ended up with. Some were genuinely compassionate and helpful. Others were corrupt, abusive, or simply incompetent. And if you had complaints about your priest, there was little you could do. the church protected its own. A tsihao, priest who was abusing his position, or his parishioners, might face internal church discipline, but that was between him and his bishop. You had no recourse. The church's control over your life extended even to your thoughts. Certain ideas were forbidden. Questioning church doctrine, expressing skepticism about miracles or saints, suggesting that maybe the social hierarchy wasn't divinely ordained, all of these could get you in serious trouble. The church taught that even sinful thoughts were dangerous and needed to be confessed. Your internal life, your private thoughts, were supposed to be monitored and controlled through confession and penance. This created an atmosphere of psychological control where you were supposed to police your own thoughts, feel guilty about natural human emotions and desires, and constantly seek church forgiveness for being human. And through all of this, the tithes, the fees, the mandatory services, the ideological control, you were told that the church was doing you a favor. It was saving your soul, providing spiritual guidance, connecting you to God. You were supposed to be grateful for the privilege of giving up 10% of your production and following countless rules that made your life harder. Some peasants were genuinely devout and found meaning and comfort in their faith, despite or because of the hardships. Religious belief could provide hope, community, and a sense that suffering had purpose. But the institutional church was fundamentally an extractive organization that took resources from peasants who could barely afford it, controlled their behavior through spiritual threats, and reinforced the social system that kept them oppressed. The medieval Catholic Church, spiritual guidance, social control, and constant fees, all wrapped up in one mandatory package. Chapter 7, Crime, Punishment, and Zero Justice, or the law is not your friend. Now let's talk about law and justice in medieval peasant life, because the legal system was essentially designed to protect the powerful and punish the weak, which meant you first understand that there were multiple overlapping legal systems. There was royal law, administered by the king's courts. There was church law, covering moral and religious matters. There was manorial law, administered by your lord's court, and there were local customs that varied by region. For peasants, the manorial court was where most legal matters were handled. This was a court run by your lord or his officials, judging cases involving peasants on the manor. See the problem? Your lord was also your judge, the same person who extracted labor and fees from you, who had economic interests in keeping you working and compliant, was also the person adjudicating disputes and determining punishments. This was not a fair or impartial system. This was a system designed to maintain lordly authority and maximize peasant exploitation. Theft was severely punished. If you were caught stealing, even if you were stealing because your family was starving, the punishment could be brutal. Whipping, branding, mutilation, or even execution for serious thefts. The irony is that your lord was essentially stealing from you all the time through excessive fees and labor obligations, but that was legal. You stealing a loaf of bread to feed your children, that's a crime worthy of having your hand cut off. Poaching, hunting on the lord's land or forests, was treated as a serious crime. Forests and wild animals were the lord's property. If you caught a rabbit or deer to feed your hungry family, you were a criminal. Punishments for poaching could include fines you couldn't afford, physical punishment, or imprisonment. In some cases, repeated poaching could result in blinding or execution. The forest laws were particularly oppressive. You couldn't gather firewood freely, couldn't hunt game, couldn't even collect fallen wood without permission. The forests that surrounded your village and could have provided valuable resources were off limits, reserved for the lord's hunting pleasure. Running away from the manor was a crime. Remember, you were tied to the land as a serf. If you tried to escape to seek a better life elsewhere, you were a fugitive. If caught, you'd be dragged back and punished. Whipping, fines, time in the stocks, or worse. Some serfs did successfully run away, especially to growing towns where city air makes you free was sometimes a real principle. If you could survive in a town for a year and a day without being caught, you might gain legal freedom. But this was risky, and many runaways were caught and punished. Disputes between peasants were handled in manorial courts, which met periodically. You'd present your case, witnesses would testify, and the lord or his steward would render judgment. But everything about this system favored those with more power and resources. Wealthier peasants could afford to bring more witnesses, could possibly bribe officials, and generally had advantages over poorer peasants. And the Lord's court had financial incentives to find people guilty because fines went to the Lord. Justice wasn't blind, it was profit-motivated. Physical punishments were common. The stocks, wooden restraints that held you immobile in a public place, were standard punishment for various offenses. You'd be locked in the stocks for hours or days, exposed to weather, unable to defend yourself from harassment or worse from passers-by. People would throw garbage at you, mock you, sometimes assault you while you were helpless. This was considered part of the punishment, public humiliation and suffering. Whipping was another common punishment. You'd be tied to a post and beaten with rods or whips, sometimes until you bled. The number of lashes depended on the offense and the judge's mood. For more serious crimes, mutilation was used. Cutting off a hand for theft, cutting off an ear for perjury, blinding for repeated poaching. These permanent disfiguring punishments would mark you as a criminal for life and make it even harder to work and survive. Execution was reserved for the most serious crimes: murder, serious theft, treason, heresy. Methods included hanging, beheading, burning at the stake, or being broken on the wheel, having your limbs broken, and then being left to die slowly. These executions were public events, meant to serve as warnings to others. You'd be forced to watch as the criminal, who might be your neighbor or even family member, was killed in painful and terrifying ways. Women accused of certain crimes, particularly those involving matters of intimacy or witchcraft accusations, faced special punishments. Ducking stools would be used to repeatedly dunk accused women in water. Scold's bridles, metal cages that fit over the head with a spiked plate that went in the mouth, were used to punish women accused of gossip or nagging. The message was clear: know your place, especially if you're a woman. Accusations of witchcraft were particularly dangerous. If you were accused, often by neighbors with grudges or during times of social stress, you faced torture to extract a confession and then likely execution by burning. The accused witch might be an older woman, a midwife whose patient died, someone who was socially isolated, or just someone who'd made enemies. The trials were travesties, where guilt was presumed, and torture was used until you confessed to whatever you were accused of. Trial by ordeal was used in some cases. You'd be subjected to a physical test, carrying hot iron, being bound and thrown in water, drinking poison, and your guilt or innocence would be determined by the results. These tests were rigged and dangerous. Trial by hot iron meant carrying a hot iron bar for several paces, then having your hand bandaged. If the wound showed infection after 3 days, you were guilty. Given medieval hygiene, wounds almost always infected. Trial by water involved being bound and thrown in a body of water. If you floated, you were guilty. The water rejected you as a sinner. If you sank, you were innocent, but you might drown in the process. These weren't rational justice systems. They were ways of providing a veneer of legitimacy to predetermined outcomes or to decisions made by those in power. Debt was another legal trap. If you borrowed money or goods and couldn't repay, you could be imprisoned or forced into additional labor obligations. Debts could be passed to your children, creating generational debt bondage. And money lending was controlled by those with resources, often with predatory interest rates. You'd borrow a small amount during a desperate time and end up owing multiples of the original amount, trapped in a debt spiral you couldn't escape. Violence against peasants by nobles or their men-at-arms was rarely punished. If a noble's soldier beat you or assaulted your wife or stole your possessions, you had little recourse. Complaining might get you in more trouble than the original offense. The legal system assumed that a noble's word was worth more than a peasant's. In disputes between a peasant and someone of higher status, the higher status person would usually win regardless of the actual facts. Even if you won a judgment in your favor, enforcement was another matter. If you were owed money or compensation by someone more powerful, actually collecting it might be impossible. Feuds between families could last generations, with cycles of revenge and counter-revenge that the legal system couldn't or wouldn't resolve. You might inherit enemies from your father or grandfather, expected to continue conflicts over slights or crimes from decades past. The legal system also controlled movement and employment. You needed permission to leave the manor, to marry, to learn a trade. These weren't rights. They were privileges granted or withheld by your lord. Violating these controls was itself a crime that could be punished, reinforcing your unfree status and making it nearly impossible to improve your situation through your own efforts. And let's talk about how crimes by the powerful were handled. They weren't. Lords who abused peasants, extracted illegal fees, demanded excessive labor, or violated customary rights faced little consequence. You could theoretically appeal to higher authorities, the king's court or church officials, but this required resources you didn't have, connections you didn't have, and risked angering your lord, which could make your life even worse. Most peasant grievances about lordly abuse went unaddressed. You'd suffer in silence, or if pushed far enough, you'd join with other peasants in rebellion, which we'll discuss soon. The law, in medieval society, was a tool of control and extraction. It protected property of the wealthy. It punished peasants for survival strategies like poaching or theft. It provided no real justice for peasant grievances, and it reinforced the social hierarchy at every turn. You had no real legal rights, no fair trials, no protection from abuse by those above you. The law was not your friend. The law was another system designed to keep you in your place and punish you for trying to escape or resist. Medieval justice for peasants, guilty until proven guiltier, with brutal punishments and no real recourse. Chapter 8. Women have it even worse, or patriarchy plus poverty. We've been talking about peasant life generally, but we need to specifically address how much worse things were if you were a peasant woman, because medieval society was deeply patriarchal, and women faced additional layers of oppression beyond what male peasants endured. Let's start with legal status. As a woman, you were essentially property. First your father's property, then your husband's. You couldn't own land in your own right in most places. You couldn't enter contracts. You couldn't represent yourself in court without a male guardian. Your entire legal existence was subsumed under the men in your life. You weren't an independent person in the eyes of the law. You were a daughter, a wife, or a widow, defined by your relationship to men. Marriage was not a choice for most peasant women. Your father or guardian would arrange your marriage, usually to someone he chose for economic or social reasons. You might meet your future husband once or twice before the wedding, or possibly not at all. You'd be married as a teenager, typically mid-teens, sometimes younger, to a man who might be significantly older. This man would have legal authority over you for the rest of your life, or his, whichever ended first, and you couldn't refuse. Well, technically you could, but the social and economic pressure was immense. An unmarried woman had few options for survival. If you refused marriage, you might be forced into it anyway, or punished, or end up destitute. Within marriage, you were expected to be obedient and submissive. Your husband had legal right to discipline you, which meant he could beat you. Domestic violence was not only legal, but was sometimes actively encouraged as a way for husbands to maintain proper authority over their wives. If you complained about being beaten, you'd likely be told you deserved it, that you must have provoked your husband, or that you should be more obedient. The church taught that wives should submit to their husbands, just as Christians submit to God. You had no right to refuse intimate relations with your husband. The concept of marital violation wasn't recognized. It was considered impossible because marriage gave the husband rights to his wife's body. you were expected to be available whenever he wanted, regardless of your desires or physical condition. And pregnancy was nearly inevitable. Without effective contraception, most married women would be pregnant frequently throughout their reproductive years. You might have a dozen or more pregnancies over your lifetime. Each pregnancy was dangerous. Childbirth could kill you. Remember that high maternal mortality rate? Every time you got pregnant, there was a real chance you wouldn't survive the birth. If you did survive, you'd be recovering from childbirth while still doing all your regular work. There was no maternity leave. You'd be back in the fields within days or at most weeks. Your body still healing, probably while nursing an infant. And caring for children was entirely your responsibility, while also doing everything else. You'd work in the fields with an infant strapped to your back. You'd do household tasks while watching multiple children. You'd try to keep children safe and fed, while also meeting all the other demands on your time. The workload for peasant women was staggering. You'd do agricultural work alongside men, planting, weeding, harvesting. You'd do all the food preparation, grinding grain, baking bread, cooking meals. You'd do textile work, spinning thread, weaving cloth, making and mending clothes for your entire family. You'd maintain the household, care for children, tend the garden, care for animals, fetch water, gather firewood, and handle countless other tasks. Your workday was probably longer than your husband's because after the field work was done, you still had hours of household tasks to complete. And all of this work was unpaid and undervalued. Your labor was considered natural women's work, not real productive labor. The economic value you created was invisible in the medieval economy. If your husband died, your situation became even more precarious. As a widow, you might have some legal rights you didn't have as a wife. Ironically, widows sometimes had more legal independence than married women, but you'd also be economically vulnerable. If your husband held land, it might pass to his male heirs, not to you. You might be left with nothing, dependent on children or other family members for support. Widows were often poor and vulnerable to exploitation. Some remarried quickly, not for love, but for economic survival. Others struggled alone, doing whatever work they could find, often ending up among the poorest members of society. Assault and harassment were constant threats. Women working in fields, traveling, or just going about daily tasks were vulnerable to assault by men who faced little consequence for their actions. If you were violated, you'd likely be blamed. The prevailing belief was that women were inherently tempting, and that men couldn't be expected to control themselves around women who weren't properly modest and supervised. Reporting such crimes was difficult and often pointless. The legal system was run by men and reflected patriarchal values. You'd need witnesses and proof, which were often impossible to provide. Your intimate history and reputation would be examined. Your credibility would be questioned. And if your attacker was someone of higher status, a lord, a priest, a wealthy man, you had essentially no recourse at all. Accusing a powerful man was dangerous and unlikely to result in justice. Pregnancy from such violence was its own nightmare. You'd be left pregnant by your attacker, and that child would still need to be cared for, adding to your burden while serving as a permanent reminder of the attack. Women were also more likely to be accused of certain crimes, particularly those related to matters of intimacy, gossip, and witchcraft. A woman who had intimate relations outside of marriage, even if violated, might be punished. A woman who spoke critically of neighbors or authorities might be punished for being a scold. And witchcraft accusations, as mentioned, disproportionately targeted women. Older women, women who were socially marginal, women who practiced folk medicine, women who'd angered neighbors, all were at risk. The witch trials were essentially a way of controlling and punishing women who didn't conform to expected roles or who'd somehow threatened male authority or social norms. Education was largely unavailable to peasant women. What little education existed was mostly for boys. Girls were expected to learn domestic skills from their mothers, not literacy or other formal education. This meant you were dependent on others to read or write for you, adding another layer of vulnerability and limiting your ability to participate in or understand the broader world. Healthcare for women's issues was minimal and often dangerous. Childbirth, as mentioned, was overseen by midwives if you were lucky. These midwives had experiential knowledge, but no formal medical training and limited tools. Complications in childbirth often couldn't be resolved. Obstructed labor, hemorrhage, infections, these would kill you. And there was nothing that could be done except pray. Menstruation was considered shameful and polluting. You'd be expected to continue working through menstrual periods despite pain and discomfort, with minimal means to manage bleeding, likely just rags that you'd wash and reuse. Women were also expected to maintain impossible standards of behavior. You were supposed to be modest, obedient, chaste, hardworking, and silent. Speaking up, showing anger, being assertive, all of these could get you labeled as a bad woman and punished. The ideal woman was essentially invisible and voiceless, working constantly but never complaining, subordinate to male authority, accepting all hardships without protest. Any woman who violated these expectations, who was too loud, too assertive, too independent, risked social punishment, legal consequences, or violence from men who felt she needed to be put back in her place. And all of this oppression was justified through religion and nature. Women were told they were inferior to men by nature, more prone to sin, intellectually weaker, and spiritually suspect. Eve's sin had corrupted all women, and you were paying the price for that original transgression. Some women internalized this and believed in their own inferiority. Others resented it, but had no way to resist effectively. A few found small ways to exercise agency and resistance, but the system was designed to crush female independence. Being a peasant woman meant all the hardships of peasant life: the poverty, the labor, the hunger, the disease, plus the additional oppressions of patriarchy. You had less freedom, less security, less control over your body and life, and more vulnerability to violence and exploitation. Medieval peasant life was terrible for everyone at the bottom, but if you were a woman, it was even worse. Chapter 9. Children are tiny laborers, or no such thing as childhood. Now let's talk about children in medieval peasant society, because the concept of childhood, as we understand it, a protected period of play, education, and development, basically didn't exist for peasant kids. Children were economic assets. More children meant more workers for the family farm. They weren't primarily valued as individuals to be nurtured and protected, but as future and current labor. This meant that from a very young age, you'd be working. By age 5 or 6, you'd be doing light tasks, gathering eggs, feeding chickens, fetching water, helping with spinning or carding wool. These weren't cute chores to teach responsibility. These were actual productive labor that the family economy depended on. By age 7 or 8, you'd be doing serious agricultural work. Boys would help with plowing, herding animals, and field work. Girls would be doing more intensive domestic labor: cooking, textile production, childcare for younger siblings, and also field work during busy seasons. There was no separation between child life and adult life, no protected space for play and learning. You worked alongside adults, doing adult tasks, just less efficiently because you were smaller and weaker. Education was essentially non-existent for peasant children. There were no schools in most villages. Literacy was rare. You'd learn by watching and doing, agricultural skills from your parents, domestic skills from your mother if you were a girl, basic crafts and tasks through apprenticeship to family members. The few peasant children who did get any education typically learned from the parish priest, if he was willing, and if your family could spare you from work, which they usually couldn't. And even this education would be basic, maybe some reading, religious instruction, perhaps basic arithmetic. For most peasant children, learning consisted of picking up skills needed for survival through observation and practice. You'd learn to sow seeds by watching your father. You'd learn to milk cows by trying and failing and eventually succeeding. You'd learn to spin thread by sitting with your mother and sisters, play existed, but it was limited and often incorporated skills that would be useful in adult work. Boys might play games that taught hunting or fighting skills. Girls might play with dolls as practice for childcare, but dedicated playtime was minimal. There was too much work to be done, and childhood ended early. By your early teens, you were essentially an adult. Teenage boys were doing full adult work. Teenage girls were marriageable and would often be married off by their mid-teens. There was no adolescence as we understand it, no transition period between childhood and adulthood. You went from being a small worker to being a full-sized worker, and somewhere in that transition, you'd be expected to start producing the next generation of workers. The mortality rate for children was horrific, as we've discussed. If you were born a peasant child, you had maybe a 60 to 70% chance of surviving to age 15. Diseases, accidents, malnutrition, all of these killed children regularly. Parents would watch multiple children die. This was so common that some parents became emotionally protective, not allowing themselves to become too attached to infants who might not survive. Others were devastated by each loss, but had no time to properly grieve because work continued and surviving children still needed care. Infant abandonment happened when families simply couldn't feed another mouth. Parents facing starvation might abandon a baby, hoping someone else would take it in, though abandoned infants usually died. During famines, children suffered most. Parents would try to feed their children, but when food ran short, difficult decisions had to be made. Some parents starved themselves to feed their children. Others had to watch their children slowly starve, unable to help. Accidents were common killers of children. Drowning in wells or streams, being kicked by animals, falling from trees or buildings, burns from fires. Peasant life was full of hazards, and children weren't carefully supervised because parents were too busy working. Children would be sent on dangerous errands, fetching water from wells they could fall into, herding animals that could hurt them, climbing to gather firewood or nuts from trees. These necessary tasks came with risks, and injuries and deaths were regular occurrences. Disabled children faced particularly difficult circumstances. There was no social support for disabilities, no special education, no accommodations. A child who was blind, deaf, intellectually disabled, or physically impaired would struggle to contribute to family labor and might be seen as a burden. Some families did their best to care for disabled children. Others might abandon them. In extreme cases during famines or desperate times, disabled children who couldn't work might be allowed to die or even actively harmed. Orphans had few options. If your parents died and you had no extended family willing or able to take you in, you'd become a ward of the Lord or church, or you'd end up begging or doing whatever work you could find. Child beggars and laborers were common in towns and cities. Some orphans were essentially enslaved, taken in by households that would feed them in exchange for unpaid labor with no prospect of inheritance or advancement. Abuse of children was common and largely accepted. Physical punishment was considered normal and necessary for discipline. Children would be beaten for misbehavior, laziness, or simply for being in the way. Harmful treatment of children, particularly girls, happened and was rarely punished. A powerful man harming a peasant girl would face little consequence. The girl might be blamed for tempting him. Boys could be apprenticed out to craftsmen or sent to serve in noble households, where they'd face harsh treatment, long hours, and possible abuse with little recourse. Some masters treated their apprentices or servants reasonably. Others were cruel. Childhood illnesses and injuries were treated with folk remedies that sometimes helped and often didn't. A child with a high fever might be given herbs that did nothing while the illness ran its course. A child with a broken bone might have it set poorly, leaving them with permanent disability. Teething, childhood diseases like measles or scarlet fever, parasites, nutritional deficiencies, all of these were just accepted parts of child rearing. You'd lose some children, the strong ones would survive, and that was considered natural. Children were also expected to care for younger siblings from a young age. A 6-year-old might be responsible for watching a toddler while parents worked. Accidents happened, and if a child died while in the care of an older sibling, that sibling would carry the guilt, but also might be punished. There was no concept of child psychology or developmental stages. Children were just small adults who needed to be made useful as quickly as possible. Their emotional needs, their need for play and exploration, their developmental requirements. None of this was understood or prioritized. Some parents genuinely loved their children and tried to protect them within the constraints of their circumstances. Others viewed children primarily as economic units. Most probably fell somewhere in between, loving their children but also needing them to contribute to survival. Religious education emphasized children's sinfulness and need for correction. Children were told they were born sinful, that they needed to be strictly disciplined, that their natural impulses were wrong and needed to be beaten out of them. This created an environment where children were both economically exploited and psychologically controlled, taught to suppress their needs and wants in favor of work and obedience. The few moments of childhood joy, festivals, games with other children, rare treats or gifts were treasured precisely because they were so rare. Most of childhood was work, hunger, discomfort, and the constant presence of death and hardship. If you survived to adulthood as a peasant child, you'd emerge physically stunted from malnutrition, psychologically shaped by early trauma and harsh treatment, and trained for nothing but the same life of grinding poverty your parents endured. And then you'd have children of your own, and the cycle would continue. Being a child in medieval peasant society, less wonder years, and more tiny laborer who might not survive to adulthood. Chapter 10. When peasants fought back, or rebellions and brutal suppressions. We've spent a lot of time discussing how oppressed and powerless peasants were, but we'd be remiss not to mention that peasants did sometimes fight back. Not often, and not usually successfully, but peasant rebellions did happen. And they tell us both how bad things were, and how violently the system would defend itself. Peasant rebellions typically erupted when conditions became unbearable. A combination of factors: increased taxation, crop failures, particularly abusive lords, social upheaval, would push peasants past their breaking point. The most famous English peasant revolt was in 1381, triggered by poll taxes, economic stress following the Black Death, and growing peasant anger at their treatment. Peasants from across the southeast of England marched on London, demanding reforms. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and influenced by radical preachers like John Ball, who famously asked, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" Basically asking, if everyone had to work in the beginning, why should some people rule over others? The rebels presented a list of demands to the young King Richard II. They wanted an end to serfdom, lower taxes, punishment for corrupt officials, and various other reforms. For a brief moment, it seemed like they might actually achieve something. The king met with them and made promises, but then things went wrong. Wat Tyler was killed during negotiations, possibly murdered. The rebellion's momentum collapsed, and once the immediate threat was over, the nobility's response was brutal. The promises made to rebels were revoked, leaders were hunted down and executed. Hundreds of participants were hanged. The message was clear: rebellion would not be tolerated. Other rebellions followed similar patterns. The Jacquerie in France in 1358 saw peasants rise up against nobility, committing terrible acts against nobles who had been abusing them for generations. The nobility's response was even worse. They massacred the rebels with extreme violence, killing thousands. The German Peasants' War in the 1520s was the largest peasant uprising, involving hundreds of thousands of peasants across multiple regions. They presented lists of grievances and demands for better treatment. The response from nobility was to crush the rebellion without mercy. Over 100,000 peasants were killed in the suppression. These rebellions tell us several important things. First, conditions really were as bad as we've been describing. People don't risk their lives in rebellion unless things are unbearable. The fact that these rebellions happened shows that peasants weren't accepting their oppression quietly. They were angry and desperate, Second, peasants were capable of organizing and fighting. When pushed too far, they could come together, form armies, and pose genuine threats to the established order. This wasn't a bunch of helpless victims. These were people who, when desperate enough, would fight back. Third, the system would defend itself with extreme violence. The nobility understood that if peasant rebellions succeeded anywhere, it could inspire rebellions everywhere. So they suppressed uprisings with maximum brutality, making examples of leaders, massacring participants, and terrorizing survivors. The violence of rebellion suppression was designed to make peasants afraid to ever try again. Public executions of rebel leaders, torture, collective punishment of villages that had participated, all of this was meant to demonstrate that rebellion was worse than oppression. But even failed rebellions sometimes led to slight improvements. After the Black Death reduced the peasant population, labor became more valuable, giving surviving peasants some bargaining power. Some lords reduced the worst abuses to avoid rebellion. The 1381 rebellion in England, despite being suppressed, was followed by a gradual decline in serfdom. It wasn't cause and effect exactly. Economic changes were also factors, but the rebellion showed that peasants could organize and pose threats, which made some nobility reconsider their policies. Smaller resistances happened constantly. Peasants would work slowly, damage tools, accidentally, poach despite laws against it, hide production too, avoid taxes, and generally engage in subtle forms of resistance that were safer than open rebellion. These small resistances were a way of clawing back tiny amounts of autonomy and resources in a system designed to extract everything from you. They didn't change the fundamental system, but they created small spaces of resistance within it. Some peasants would flee to towns or cities, where they might find freedom and new opportunities. This wasn't rebellion exactly, but it was a form of resistance, refusing to accept your assigned place and seeking something better. The church sometimes provided outlets for peasant grievances. Some priests and monks genuinely sympathized with peasant suffering and preached about social justice and the spiritual equality of all people. These messages could be subversive, even if they stopped short of calling for actual rebellion. Heretical movements sometimes attracted peasant followers by questioning church and noble authority. The Lollards. In England, the Hussites in Bohemia, and various other movements offered theological justifications for questioning the established order. But these movements were violently suppressed too. The church and nobility worked together to crush heresies, burning leaders at the stake and persecuting followers. The fact that rebellion was usually crushed doesn't mean it was pointless. Rebellions showed that peasants weren't content, that the system required violence to maintain itself, and that given the opportunity, peasants would seek freedom and better conditions. And sometimes, very slowly, things did improve. The gradual decline of serfdom across Europe over centuries wasn't just economic evolution. It was also the result of peasant resistance, rebellion, and refusal to accept the worst conditions. By the late medieval period and into the early modern era, serfdom was declining in Western Europe, though it persisted in Eastern Europe much longer. Peasants had more freedom of movement, more legal rights, and somewhat better conditions. This wasn't because nobles suddenly became nicer. It was because economic changes made it less profitable to maintain strict serfdom, and because peasant resistance, both violent and non-violent, made the old system harder to maintain. But during the height of the medieval period, rebellion was risky and usually unsuccessful. Most peasants never participated in major uprisings. They endured their oppression, engaged in small resistances when they could, and hoped for something better. If not in this life, then in the next. The peasant rebellions show us that medieval peasants weren't just passive victims. They were people who, when pushed too far, would fight for their dignity and rights. The fact that they usually lost doesn't diminish their courage. It just shows how powerful and violent the system was that kept them oppressed. Peasant rebellions, proof that even the most oppressed people will eventually fight back, and proof that the powerful will do anything to maintain their power. Chapter 11. The Seasons of Suffering, or Winter Will Kill You. Let's talk about how the seasons affected peasant life. because your suffering varied throughout the year in different and creative ways. Spring was, ironically, one of the worst times, despite being traditionally associated with renewal. This was the hungry season. You'd depleted your food stores from the previous harvest, but new crops weren't ready yet. By late spring, you'd be scraping the bottom of grain barrels, eating whatever preserved vegetables were left, and generally going hungry. Your body, already malnourished, would be weakening at exactly the time you needed energy for spring planting. You'd be weak from hunger, but had to do hard physical labor. This labor would make you hungrier, but there wasn't more food available. So you'd work while starving, your body consuming its own muscle tissue, getting weaker day by day. Children and the elderly suffered most during the hungry season. Families would prioritize feeding those who could work, adult men and women, because their labor was essential. Some didn't survive. Malnutrition would weaken people, making them vulnerable to diseases. Late spring would bring some relief as early vegetables became available, greens, herbs, anything that grew quickly. These would be eaten eagerly, providing nutrients after months of grain-heavy diet. Summer brought heat that could be brutal when working in fields all day. Without sunscreen, protective clothing, or adequate water, you'd suffer sunburn, heat exhaustion, and dehydration. Summer also brought insects, flies, mosquitoes, biting flies, gnats. They'd swarm while you worked. The combination of heat, insects, and hard labor made summer work miserable. Late summer and early fall brought harvest, the most intense work period of the year. Every able person would be in the fields, from before dawn to after, dusk racing against weather and time. This was backbreaking labor that went on for weeks. You'd work until your hands bled, your back screamed, and your body was ready to collapse. The harvest determined whether you'd eat well or poorly for the coming year. After harvest, there might be brief abundance. Harvest festivals would celebrate this completion. This was the best time of year. Food was available, the hardest work was done. But fall also meant preparing for winter. Firewood had to be gathered and stored, enormous amounts. Animals that wouldn't be kept through winter had to be slaughtered. Food preservation was critical. And then came winter, perhaps the worst season of all. Medieval peasant cottages were not well heated. That single fire pit provided some warmth, but couldn't adequately heat the space. Cold would seep through poorly insulated walls. You'd be cold constantly, bitter bone-deep cold you couldn't escape. You'd go to bed cold, wake up cold, work in. The cold, come home to a cottage barely warmer than outside. Chilblains were common, frostbite was a real risk. Winter work still had to be done. Animals needed care, firewood needed bringing in, repairs had to be made. The cold made work harder and more dangerous. Numb fingers couldn't grip tools. Icy conditions made travel treacherous. Days were short, giving limited daylight. Winter increased house fire risk. You needed fire constantly, which meant increased risk of it getting out of control and burning down your thatched roof cottage. Illness increased in winter. Respiratory infections would sweep through villages. People huddling for warmth in poorly ventilated spaces would spread diseases. If you got sick in winter, your survival chances were worse. Food ran low as winter progressed. By late winter, you'd be rationing carefully. Some families wouldn't have enough and would slowly starve. The psychological toll of winter was severe. You'd be trapped inside in dark, cold, uncomfortable conditions, worried about whether your food would last and whether everyone would survive until spring. The seasons weren't just weather patterns. They were different flavors of suffering, a year-long cycle of hardships that never stopped, just changed form. Medieval peasants experienced seasons not as pleasant variations in weather, but as an endless rotation of challenges, each requiring different forms of grueling labor, and each bringing specific threats to health and survival. And after surviving winter, if you survived, you'd emerge into spring, weak and hungry, just in time for the hungry season to start the cycle over again. Year after year, generation after generation, the wheel kept turning, grinding people down until their bodies gave out or disease took them. Chapter 12: Old Age and Death, or You Probably Won't Get There. Let's talk about what happened if you survived to old age as a peasant, which most people didn't. For those who did, old age was not a golden retirement. It was just a new form of suffering. Old age, in medieval peasant terms, meant your 40s or 50s, maybe 60s if exceptionally lucky. A peasant who lived to 60 was ancient by contemporary standards. And this wasn't a healthy 60. This was a body completely broken down by decades of brutal labor, malnutrition, disease, and injuries. A 50-year-old peasant might look and feel like a modern 80-year-old. Your body would be falling apart. Arthritis from years of physical labor would make every movement painful. Old injuries would ache constantly. Your back, stressed by decades of bending and lifting, would be permanently damaged. Your joints would be worn out. Teeth, already bad, would be mostly gone by this age. Eating would be difficult. You'd have to gum your food or eat only soft things. This would contribute to further nutritional deficiencies. Your vision would be declining, making work more difficult. Your hearing might be going. Your strength and endurance would be a fraction of what they once were. You'd be trying to do the same work you'd always done, but with a body that could no longer do it. And there was no retirement, no pension, no social security. You worked until you physically couldn't anymore, because stopping meant having no income and no way to support yourself. Your value to your family and community was based on your ability to work. As you became less able to contribute labor, you became more of a burden. This wasn't necessarily because people were cruel. It was because resources were so scarce that non-productive members of the household were luxuries that poor families couldn't afford. Some elderly peasants were cared for lovingly by their children or extended family. Others were resented, seen as mouths to feed when food was scarce. The quality of your old age depended heavily on your family relationships and their economic situation. If you'd had children who survived to adulthood, they might support you. This was part of why having children was important. They were your retirement plan. You'd spent years raising them, and now they'd care for you in your decline. But if your children were struggling themselves, or if they'd died, or if you'd never had children, your situation could be desperate. Some elderly peasants ended up begging, dependent on charity from the church or community. The poorest elderly might end up in almshouses, charitable institutions run by the church that provided minimal care for the destitute. These weren't comfortable places. They provided basic shelter and food, but conditions were poor, and residents were there because they had nowhere else to go. Elderly people who could no longer work might be given lighter tasks. An old man might watch animals rather than do field work. An old woman might spin thread or do other sedentary tasks. But even these lighter tasks required abilities that might be beyond them. The psychological experience of aging as a peasant was grim. You'd watch your body fail, knowing there was no medical help, no way to ease the pain, no prospect of comfortable retirement. You'd become dependent on others, losing the independence you'd fought so hard to maintain. Many elderly peasants must have felt their lives were over well before death came. They'd lived hard lives, accumulated nothing, had no comfort to show for decades of labor. They'd be in constant pain, increasingly unable to care for themselves, waiting for death. When serious illness or injury came, in old age, that was usually the end. An elderly peasant who broke a hip or developed serious illness would likely die. There was no intensive medical care, no rehabilitation, no hope of recovery. Death, when it came, might almost be a relief. After years or decades of pain and struggle, dying ended the suffering. This wasn't romantic. It was just reality. Life was hard enough that death could seem like rest. The actual dying process was usually not quick or easy. You might die slowly from an infection, from cancer, from organ failure, from any number of conditions. Pain management was minimal. Maybe some herbs, maybe alcohol, but mostly you just suffered through it. You'd die in your cottage, probably in the same straw bed you'd slept in for years, surrounded by family if you were lucky. A priest might be called to give last rites, if your family could afford it and if there was time. Last rites were important in medieval Catholic belief. Dying without them meant your soul might be in danger. So even poor families would try to get a priest for dying relatives, though this meant paying fees at a time when money was already tight. After death, your body would be washed and prepared by family members. You'd be laid out in your cottage for a day or so before burial. The body would start to decompose, especially in warm weather. But embalming wasn't an option for peasants. Burial would be in the village churchyard, probably in an unmarked grave, or with a simple wooden marker that would decay quickly. Only the wealthy got stone monuments. Your grave would eventually be lost, dug over for new burials, your bones mixed with those of countless other forgotten peasants. There would be no elaborate funeral, maybe a simple service. Your family and neighbors would attend if they could spare the time from work. There might be a small gathering afterward. Your possessions would be divided among your heirs, such as they were. A few tools, some cooking implements, maybe some clothing. This wasn't a substantial inheritance. Your children would continue the same hard life you'd lived. There was no legacy beyond survival. You hadn't built anything lasting, hadn't accumulated wealth, hadn't achieved anything that would be remembered. You'd worked hard your entire life and had nothing to show for it, except children who would repeat the cycle. Some peasants found meaning in their lives through family, community, or religious faith. They believed their suffering had spiritual purpose, that they were living as God intended, that their reward would come in the afterlife. Others died bitter and exhausted, feeling their lives had been wasted in servitude to lords and church who took everything and gave back nothing. Most probably felt somewhere in between, grateful for small joys and relationships, resigned to hardships they couldn't change, hoping for better for their children, while knowing that hope was probably futile. Chapter 13. The Few Bright Spots, or Small Joys in a Sea of Hardship. Before we wrap up, we should acknowledge that peasant life wasn't unrelenting misery every single moment. There were small joys, moments of respite, and aspects of community life that provided some relief from the grinding hardship. These didn't make peasant life good, but they made it survivable. Village festivals and holy days provided breaks from work and opportunities for celebration. Harvest festivals, after the intense labor of bringing in crops, would include communal feasting, music, dancing, and general merriment. For a day or two, you'd actually have enough food, would be surrounded by your community, and could forget about the hardships temporarily. Christmas and Easter were major celebrations with special foods, religious services, and social gatherings. These holidays broke up the monotony and gave people something to look forward to. The church required that certain days be observed, which meant lords couldn't demand work on those days. There were also local festivals, saints' days, and traditional celebrations that varied by region. May Day celebrations, midsummer festivals, various local traditions. These created a rhythm to the year beyond just agricultural seasons. During festivals, normal social hierarchies would sometimes be temporarily relaxed. There might be role reversals where peasants could mock nobility, or communal activities that brought different classes together. This wasn't revolution, but it was a release valve for social tensions. Music and dance were important parts of peasant culture. People would sing while working, would gather to dance during festivals, would tell stories and jokes during long winter evenings. This oral culture was rich and vibrant, even if most of it wasn't written down and has been lost to history. Folk tales, songs, legends, jokes. These passed down through generations, creating a shared cultural identity among peasants. Some of these stories subtly mocked the nobility or church, providing a form of resistance through culture. Family bonds, when they were strong, provided emotional support and meaning. You might love your spouse, adore your children, have deep connections with siblings and parents. These relationships could make hardship more bearable. The experience of holding your newborn child, watching your children grow, sharing life with a partner you cared about. These fundamental human experiences were available to peasants, even in their poverty. Love and family connection weren't exclusive to the wealthy. Community solidarity was important. Your neighbors understood what you were going through because they were going through it too. You'd help each other during harvest, would share resources when someone was struggling, would support each other through illnesses and deaths. This mutual aid wasn't charity. It was survival strategy. You'd help your neighbor today, knowing you might need their help tomorrow. But it also created genuine bonds of community and belonging. Village commons, shared lands where everyone could graze animals or gather resources, were communally managed. This required cooperation and created a sense of shared investment in the community. You weren't just an isolated individual, you were part of a collective. There was pride in work well done. A field planted neatly, a harvest brought in efficiently, bread baked well, cloth woven tightly. These were skills you could take pride in, even if the results were appropriated by others. The work itself could provide a sense of accomplishment. Some peasants developed expertise in particular tasks, becoming known as the best thatcher in the village, or the most skilled with animals, or the person everyone came to for advice about planting. This recognition, while not translating to wealth, did provide social status and respect within the community. Religious faith, for those who genuinely believed, provided comfort and meaning. The belief that suffering had spiritual purpose, that this life was temporary, that justice would come in the afterlife. These beliefs helped people endure otherwise unbearable conditions. Prayer and religious ritual gave structure to life and provided hope. Saints could be petitioned for help. Miracles were believed to happen. The church, despite its oppressive aspects, also provided community, ritual, and spiritual comfort. For some, religious experiences were genuinely transcendent and meaningful, providing psychological and emotional sustenance that made material poverty more bearable. The natural world provided its own forms of beauty and joy. A beautiful sunset after a day of hard work. The satisfaction of seeing crops growing. The change of seasons. The birth of animals in spring. These simple pleasures were available, even to the poorest peasants. Humor was a coping mechanism. People would joke about their hardships, would laugh together at absurdities, would find comedy even in dark situations. Medieval peasants weren't always miserable. They laughed, they joked, they found ways to be amused despite everything. Food, when it was available, was appreciated. The simple pleasure of eating when you're hungry, of having enough for once, of tasting something good, these were real joys, perhaps more intense because of their rarity and contrast with constant scarcity. Children, despite the hardships of child rearing, brought joy. Watching a child learn to walk, hearing them laugh, seeing them grow. These were experiences that transcended material conditions. Parents could love their children and find meaning in that relationship despite poverty. Courtship and romance existed even among peasants. Young people would flirt, would fall in love, would experience the excitement and joy of romantic attraction. These feelings weren't reserved for nobility. Peasants were human and experienced the full range of human emotions. Friendships were important sources of support and joy. Your best friend from childhood, the person you'd worked alongside for years, the neighbor you gossiped with while doing chores. These relationships enriched life beyond just survival. Small rebellions and resistances provided satisfaction. Successfully hiding some produce from the tax collector, poaching a rabbit without getting caught, working slowly when the Lord's steward wasn't watching. These tiny acts of resistance felt like victories. Dreams and hopes, however unrealistic, kept people going. The hope that the next harvest would be better. The dream that your children might have slightly better lives. The fantasy of a better world. Even if these hopes were rarely fulfilled, they provided psychological fuel to continue. The survival itself was a kind of victory, making it through another winter, recovering from an illness, overcoming a crisis. These were accomplishments in a world where survival wasn't guaranteed. The point of acknowledging these bright spots isn't to minimize the suffering or suggest that peasant life was actually fine. It wasn't. It was objectively terrible. in ways we've spent thousands of words documenting. But humans are resilient and adaptive. People found ways to create meaning, experience joy, and maintain hope, even in conditions of severe oppression and hardship. This is testament to human psychological flexibility and the drive to find meaning in existence. Peasants weren't just suffering victims, they were complete human beings who experienced the full range of human emotions and experiences within their constrained circumstances. They laughed, loved, hoped, and dreamed, even while hungry, oppressed, and suffering. Acknowledging this doesn't change the fact that their lives were much harder than they should have been, that they were exploited and oppressed, and that the system they lived under was unjust. But it does acknowledge their humanity and the ways they resisted complete dehumanization by the system. The small joys in peasant life were like patches of sunlight in a dark forest, brief, precious, insufficient to illuminate the whole, but meaningful to those who experienced them. They didn't make peasant life good, but they made it bearable enough to continue. Conclusion: the reality of the medieval majority. Let's talk about what happened if you survived to old age as a peasant, which most people didn't. For those who did, old age was not a golden retirement. It was just a new form of suffering. Old age, in medieval peasant terms, meant your 40s or 50s, maybe 60s if exceptionally lucky. A peasant who lived to 60 was ancient by contemporary standards. And this wasn't a healthy 60. This was a body completely broken down by decades of brutal labor, malnutrition, disease, and injuries. A 50-year-old peasant might look and feel like a modern 80-year-old. Arthritis from years of physical labor would make every movement painful. Old injuries would ache constantly. Your back would be permanently damaged, your joints worn out, teeth would be mostly gone, eating would be difficult, your vision declining, hearing going, strength and endurance a fraction of what they were. And there was no retirement, no pension. You worked until you physically couldn't, because stopping meant having no income and no way to support yourself. Your value was based on your ability to work. As you became less able to contribute labor, you became more of a burden. Some elderly peasants were cared for lovingly by family. Others were resented as mouths to feed. If you'd had surviving children, they might support you. They were your retirement plan. But if they were struggling, or had died, or you'd never had children, your situation could be desperate. The poorest elderly might end up begging or in almshouses, charitable institutions providing minimal care. These weren't comfortable places. When serious illness or injury came in old age, that was usually the end. An elderly peasant who broke a hip or developed serious illness would likely die. Death, when it came, might almost be a relief. After years of pain and struggle, dying ended the suffering. You'd die in your cottage, surrounded by family if lucky. A priest might be called for last rites, if your family could afford it. After death, your body would be prepared by family. You'd be laid out briefly before burial in the village churchyard, probably in an unmarked grave. There would be no elaborate funeral, maybe a simple service. Your possessions would be divided. A few tools, some implements, maybe clothing. There was no legacy beyond survival. You hadn't built anything lasting, hadn't accumulated wealth. You'd worked hard your entire life and had nothing to show for it, except children who would repeat the cycle. Chapter 13, The Few Bright Spots, or Small Joys in a Sea of Hardship. Before we wrap up, we should acknowledge that peasant life wasn't unrelenting misery every single moment. There were small joys, moments of respite, and aspects of community life that provided some relief from the grinding hardship. Village festivals and holy days provided breaks from work and opportunities for celebration. Harvest festivals, after the intense labor of bringing in crops, would include communal, feasting, music, dancing, and general merriment. For a day or two, you'd actually have enough food, would be surrounded by your community, and could forget about the hardships temporarily. Christmas and Easter were major celebrations with special foods, religious services, and social gatherings. These holidays broke up the monotony and gave people something to look forward to. During festivals, normal social hierarchies would sometimes be temporarily relaxed. There might be role reversals, where peasants could mock nobility, or communal activities that brought different classes together. This wasn't revolution, but it was a release valve for social tensions. Music and dance were important parts of peasant culture. People would sing while working, would gather to dance during festivals, would tell stories and jokes during long winter evenings. This oral culture was rich and vibrant, even if most of it wasn't written down and has been lost to history. Family bonds, when they were strong, provided emotional support and meaning. You might love your spouse, adore your children, have deep connections with siblings and parents. These relationships could make hardship more bearable. Community solidarity was important. Your neighbors understood what you were going through because they were going through it too. You'd help each other during harvest, would share resources when someone was struggling, would support each other through illnesses and deaths. This mutual aid wasn't charity, it was survival strategy. You'd help your neighbor today knowing you might need their help tomorrow. But it also created genuine bonds of community and belonging. There was pride in work well done, a field planted neatly, a harvest brought in efficiently, bread baked well, cloth woven tightly. These were skills you could take pride in, even if the results were appropriated by others. Religious faith, for those who genuinely believed, provided comfort and meaning. The belief that suffering had spiritual purpose, that this life was temporary, that justice would come in the afterlife. These beliefs helped people endure otherwise unbearable conditions. The natural world provided its own forms of beauty and joy. A beautiful sunset after a day of hard work. The satisfaction of seeing crops growing. The change of seasons, the birth of animals in spring. Humor was a coping mechanism. People would joke about their hardships, would laugh together at absurdities, would find comedy even in dark situations. Food, when it was available, was appreciated. The simple pleasure of eating when you're hungry, of having enough for once, of tasting something good. These were real joys, perhaps more intense because of their rarity. Children, despite the hardships of child rearing, brought joy. Watching a child learn to walk, hearing them laugh, seeing them grow. These were experiences that transcended material conditions. Small rebellions and resistances provided satisfaction. Successfully hiding some produce from the tax collector. Poaching a rabbit without getting caught. Working slowly when the Lord's steward wasn't watching. The point of acknowledging these bright spots isn't to minimize the suffering or suggest that peasant life was actually fine. It wasn't. It was objectively terrible, in ways we've spent thousands of words documenting. But humans are resilient and adaptive. People found ways to create meaning, experience joy, and maintain hope, even in conditions of severe oppression and hardship. Peasants weren't just suffering victims. They were complete human beings who experienced the full range of human emotions and experiences within their constrained circumstances. The small joys in peasant life were like patches of sunlight in a dark forest, brief, precious, insufficient to illuminate the whole, but meaningful to those who experienced them. Conclusion: the reality of the medieval majority. So here we are. We've spent 20,000 words exploring exactly why being a medieval peasant was one of the worst possible existences in human history. Everything we've discussed, the feudal oppression, the backbreaking labor, the terrible living conditions, the inadequate food, the disease, the violence, the lack of rights, the religious control, the constant suffering. This was the reality for the vast majority of people living in medieval Europe. When we think about the Middle Ages, we often think about knights, castles, kings, and battles. But for every knight in shining armor, there were hundreds or thousands of peasants working the fields that fed him. The medieval period lasted roughly 1,000 years and covered a vast geographic area. Not everything we've discussed applied equally everywhere and at all times. There were regional variations, changes over time, differences between areas, but the broad patterns held. Most people were peasants. Most peasants lived in poverty and oppression. Most worked incredibly hard for minimal reward. Most died young after lives of suffering. This isn't ancient history. This was the lived reality of the majority of our ancestors. If you go back far enough in your family tree, you almost certainly have ancestors who lived as medieval peasants. Your ancestors probably lived in a one-room hovel, worked fields they didn't own, paid oppressive fees and taxes, went hungry regularly, buried multiple children, and died before reaching what we'd consider middle age. Understanding peasant life helps us understand why the modern world, with all its problems, is still vastly better than the past. We have rights that peasants couldn't imagine. We have freedoms of movement, expression, and opportunity that were completely unavailable to them. We can choose our careers, our homes, our partners. We can leave situations that don't work for us. We have access to education, healthcare, and social support systems that didn't exist for peasants. Even people who are struggling in modern developed countries have options and safety nets that medieval peasants would have seen as impossibly luxurious. This isn't to say modern problems aren't real or serious. They are, but it's important to have historical perspective about how much human life has improved for most people. We also need to recognize that the improvements didn't come automatically or inevitably. They came through struggle, resistance, and gradual social changes. Medieval peasants weren't passive victims. They were people who resisted where they could, who maintained their dignity despite oppression, who created communities and cultures within the constraints they faced. We should also acknowledge that similar conditions to medieval peasant life still exist in parts of the world today. There are still people living in poverty, working in conditions of near servitude, with minimal rights and limited opportunities. The fight against oppression and exploitation isn't just historical, it's ongoing. Understanding how bad things were helps us recognize how bad things still can be and why it's important to support human rights, fair labor practices, and social justice. The medieval peasant experience also teaches us about resilience and the human capacity to endure. People survived conditions that seem unbearable. They found joy in small things, maintained hope against hope, and kept going even when there was no rational reason to think things would improve. So what's the takeaway from all of this? First, appreciate what we have. The next time you're annoyed about some modern inconvenience, remember that you're not a medieval peasant. You have clean water, indoor plumbing, enough food, access to health care, rights under law, and the freedom to improve your circumstances. Second, recognize that progress is real, but not inevitable. The improvements in human life between the medieval period and now didn't happen automatically. They happened through human effort, struggle, and social change. Third, remember that the comfortable lives many of us lead are built on the labor and suffering of countless people throughout history who never got to experience such comfort. Fourth, be skeptical of nostalgia for the past. The good old days weren't good for most people. Medieval life wasn't romantic or noble or simple in a good way. It was brutal and hard and short for the vast majority of people. Fifth, understand that social hierarchies and systems of oppression are constructed by humans and can be changed by humans. The feudal system seemed eternal and unchangeable to people living under it, but it did eventually change. Finally, remember that history is mostly the story of ordinary people living ordinary lives, which, for most of history, meant hard lives. The peasants, whose names we don't know, whose stories weren't written down, who lived and died in obscurity, were the majority of humanity for centuries. They deserve to be remembered and understood, not as background characters in someone else's story, but as people whose experiences were real and whose lives mattered. Being a medieval peasant was terrible. It was terrible in countless ways, from the dramatic to the mundane. It was terrible systematically, built into the economic, social, and religious structures of the time. It was terrible reliably, generation after generation, with little hope of improvement or escape. And it was terrible for the vast majority of people living during a huge span of human history. So the next time you see a movie or read a book about the medieval period focusing on knights and castles and royal intrigue, remember, that's a tiny fraction of the story. The bigger story is the one we've told here. The story of millions of people working themselves to death in fields they didn't own, living in hovels, dying young, and leaving nothing behind but more peasants to continue the cycle. That's the reality of the medieval period for most people. That's what we should remember when we think about that time. The medieval era. Fascinating to study, historically important, culturally influential, and absolutely terrible to actually live through if you were part of the 90% or so of people at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Thanks for joining me on this journey through medieval peasant suffering. I hope you've learned something about historical reality and gained some appreciation for the ways in which modern life, despite its problems, is vastly better than what most of our ancestors endured. And I hope you're grateful that you're not a medieval peasant, because seriously, it was awful. This has been Why It Sucked to Be a Medieval Peasant. Now you know. And knowing is half the battle. The other half is being glad you live in a time with antibiotics, workers' rights, and the ability to complain about your life without being locked in the stocks. See you next time when we'll explore another historical topic that's probably worse than you imagined. Because that's what we do here. We take your comfortable assumptions about history and thoroughly ruin them with actual facts. Until then, appreciate your indoor plumbing, your food security, your medical care, and your freedom to choose your own path in life. Millions of people throughout history had none of those things. Stay safe, stay free, and be grateful for every right and comfort you have, because people fought and died so you could have them. This has been Sleepless Historian. Thanks for watching.